person who cannot speak does not mean they have no voice. The words cut through the restaurant's air like a blade, calm, steady, yet carrying the weight of undeniable truth. The room, once filled with the soft clinking of silverware and hushed conversations, had fallen into complete silence. Every pair of eyes was now locked onto one man, Keanu Reeves. A few moments earlier, a waiter had been impatiently tapping his pen against his notepad, frustration evident in every motion. Across the table sat Lucas, a young man who couldn't speak, not because he didn't want to, but because he was born that way. He'd been trying to order a meal, a simple task that had turned into something much harder than it should have been. But now, things had changed. Keanu Reeves had stood up. What happened next would shock everyone in the room and teach a lesson that no one would soon forget. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know, where are you watching from? If you love stories about kindness, justice, and standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe. More inspiring stories are coming your way. Now, let's begin our story. The evening glow of the city spilled into Le Vuchain, a cozy yet refined restaurant that balanced between casual dining and upscale experience. It was the kind of place where the scent of seared steak and freshly baked bread lingered in the air, where dim lighting softened the edges of conversation, and where a meal cost just enough to make one pause before ordering. It wasn't extravagant, but it was more than Lucas would normally afford. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, he had a reason to celebrate. Lucas stepped inside, pausing briefly at the entrance. His fingers instinctively brushed against his pocket where his small blue notebook should have been. His heart sank. He had spent years relying on it, a simple tool that made life easier, a way to bridge the gap between him and a world that often didn't know how to accommodate him. But tonight, it was gone. He had lost it somewhere between home and here, and now, without it, ordering would be far more difficult. He exhaled slowly, pushing aside the frustration. He wasn't going to let this ruin his night. He took a table near the window, the glow of the city lights reflecting faintly against the glass. This meal meant something to him. It was a quiet, personal victory, a way of telling himself that he had made it, despite the doubts, despite the struggles. He had completed an online course, one that had taken months of relentless effort. A small achievement to some, but to him, it was proof that he was capable of more than people often assumed. And tonight, he was here to acknowledge that. Across the restaurant, Keanu Reeves stirred his coffee, flipping through the worn pages of a book. Dressed in a simple black leather jacket and faded jeans, he blended into the background, unnoticed by most. He liked it that way. He wasn't here to be seen, he was here to observe. Years in Hollywood had taught him the art of studying people without drawing attention to himself. He noticed the couple near the bar engaged in an intense but hushed argument. The family of four where the mother subtly calmed her restless child, and the young waiter moving briskly between tables with an air of exhaustion that came from serving one too many impatient customers. That waiter, Brandon, was barely holding himself together. The night had been long and the tips had been low. He had rent to pay, bills piling up, and a manager breathing down his neck. This wasn't the dream he had for himself, yet here he was, repeating the same motions, taking orders for people who barely looked at him. He had already dealt with a difficult customer earlier, some guy who kept changing his order after Brandon had already sent it to the kitchen. He wasn't in the mood for more complication. Lucas, unaware of the storm brewing behind Brandon's tired eyes, glanced at the menu. He could read it just fine, but there was a problem. He had severe food allergies. Certain ingredients, nuts, dairy, specific sauces, could trigger dangerous reactions. Normally, he would write his order down in his notebook, listing out the modifications he needed. But tonight that option was gone. Brandon arrived at the table, pen and notepad in hand. "Hey there, what can I get you?" His voice was polite on the surface, but there was a sharpness in the way he tapped his pen against the page. Lucas looked up and smiled briefly before pointing at an item on the menu. He hesitated. That dish usually came with a sauce he couldn't eat. He needed to communicate that. He touched his throat, then shook his head, gesturing toward the menu again. He tapped on it twice, then traced a line through the air, trying to indicate that he wanted the dish without the sauce. Brandon barely glanced at the menu. He had seen customers hesitate before, some because they were indecisive, others because they wanted to be difficult. He was tired. He was done with difficulty. "All right, I don't know what that means," Brandon muttered under his breath, shifting his weight impatiently. Lucas frowned slightly and pointed again, slower this time, emphasizing his gestures. He mimed eating, then crossed his hands in an X, shaking his head. Brandon sighed heavily. "Look, man, I've got a lot of tables to cover if you can't say what you want. I don't have time to play charades." A few customers at nearby tables glanced up. Lucas felt the familiar sting of frustration creeping in. This wasn't the first time someone had been impatient with him, but it still hurt. He wasn't playing charades. He was trying to make sure he didn't end up in a hospital tonight. He inhaled deeply, keeping his expression calm. He picked up a napkin, grabbed the pen resting near the salt shaker, and started writing, carefully spelling out his request. No sauce, no dairy, severe allergy. Brandon scoffed, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "You know, if you can't order like a normal person, maybe you shouldn't be eating at a restaurant like this." The words landed like a slap. A stunned hush fell over the nearest tables. Some guests pretended not to hear, looking back at their plates. Others exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Lucas's fingers tightened around the napkin, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. He had dealt with dismissive people before, but the open humiliation in Brandon's voice was different. Across the restaurant, Keanu set his book down. He had seen situations like this before. He had witnessed time and time again how people who were different were treated as burdens rather than human beings. He recognized the moment when frustration turned into cruelty, when impatience crossed into humiliation. Lucas inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. He flipped the napkin over and continued writing, determined not to let this man ruin his night. But before he could finish, Brandon rolled his eyes and turned away. "I'll come back when you figure it out," he muttered, walking off toward another table. Lucas sat frozen for a moment. He had promised himself long ago that he wouldn't let people like this break him. But tonight, sitting alone in a restaurant where he had come to celebrate himself, surrounded by people who chose to say nothing, he felt small. Keanu exhaled slowly and pushed his coffee cup aside. He had seen enough. Brandon clenched his jaw as he moved toward another table, gripping his notepad tighter than necessary. His frustration wasn't just about Lucas. It had been a long day, full of customers snapping their fingers at him, sending orders back and barely tipping. Rent was due in a week, his credit card balance was getting worse, and his manager had already pulled him aside earlier to lecture him about customer service. And now some guy was making his job harder by refusing to just point and nod like everyone else. He wasn't in the mood for patience. He was in the mood to get through this shift and go home. Lucas sat at his table, shoulders tense, fingers tracing the edge of the napkin he had tried to write on. His stomach churned, not from hunger but from frustration. He had spent years learning how to navigate a world that didn't accommodate him, carefully picking places where he could communicate with minimal trouble. But tonight, his system had failed him. Without his notebook, every simple interaction became an uphill battle, and instead of understanding, he was met with hostility. He considered leaving, but that felt like surrender. He had come here to celebrate, not to shrink away. Across the restaurant, Keanu Reeves took another slow sip of coffee, his gaze following the exchange. He wasn't one to intervene in every little injustice he saw. He knew the world was full of them, and he couldn't fix everything. But this was different. The sharpness in Brandon's tone, the way the surrounding tables chose silent discomfort over speaking up, the quiet way Lucas absorbed the humiliation without protest, it all settled in his chest like a weight. He watched as Lucas reached for the napkin again, his movements slightly unsteady. Keanu had seen enough. Brandon turned back toward Lucas's table, ready to take his order properly this time. But before he could open his mouth, something shifted in the air. A chair scraped against the floor. The room, which had been humming with quiet conversation and the soft clatter of silverware, grew eerily still. A presence loomed beside Lucas's table. Not aggressive, not loud, but undeniable. Brandon blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sudden change. Then he realized who was standing there. Keanu Reeves. Recognition flickered in his eyes. The face was unmistakable, the same one that had graced billboards, movie posters, and action sequences that had played on his TV late at night. But in this moment, Keanu wasn't an action hero. He wasn't John Wick, nor Neo, nor any character he had played. He was just a man standing beside a stranger who had been mistreated, and somehow that felt even more intimidating than any fictional role. Brandon's throat went dry. Keanu's expression was unreadable. Calm but firm, not angry but not amused. "I watched the whole thing," he said, voice smooth but carrying an edge. "Every time he tried to communicate, you shut him down. Not just ignored him, you humiliated him." His words weren't loud, yet they carried enough weight that the nearest diners stiffened in their seats. A few cast glances at Brandon, some in curiosity, others in quiet judgment. It was suddenly very clear that everyone was watching. Brandon's pulse quickened. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His usual defenses, the excuses about being busy, about difficult customers, about stress, felt flimsy in the face of someone who had just seen everything. His gaze darted toward the manager, silently pleading for backup. But Calloway, who had been observing from the bar, didn't move. His expression was unreadable, but there was no saving grace in his stance. Brandon was on his own. "I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone," Brandon finally muttered, his voice lacking the usual bravado. I didn't know what he wanted, and it was holding up service." He sounded defensive, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were weak. The weight of Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "You had options," Keanu replied simply. "You could have written things down, asked for help, did anything other than what you did." His tone wasn't condescending, wasn't accusatory, it was just a fact. And somehow, that made it worse. A ripple of murmurs spread through the restaurant, the weight of silent spectators pressing against Brandon's chest. He wasn't just an annoyed waiter dealing with an inconvenient customer anymore. He was a man who had mistreated someone in front of Keanu Reeves, and now he had to live with that reality. Calloway finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Brandon," he said, his voice even, but carrying authority. "My office. Now." Brandon swallowed hard, but before he moved, Keanu did something unexpected. He picked up the napkin Lucas had written on and handed it directly to him. "This is his order," Keanu said. "You're going to take it, and this time, you're going to do it with respect." His words weren't a request, they were a finality. Brandon hesitated, but the weight of the moment was too heavy to fight. He reached for the napkin, his fingers trembling slightly, and turned toward the kitchen, head lowered. The moment he disappeared, the restaurant remained still for another breath, before the tension finally cracked. A hesitant round of applause started somewhere in the back, rippling outward until multiple diners joined in. Keanu ignored it, his attention shifting back to Lucas. In a quiet, subtle gesture, he signed 2 words. "You're safe." Lucas's eyes widened slightly in surprise, before softening into something warm, something grateful. For the first time that night, he felt seen. The restaurant gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the air still buzzed with the aftershock of what had just happened. Some guests glanced toward Keanu with newfound respect, while others seemed lost in thought, reconsidering their own silence. At a nearby table, an older man lifted his glass slightly, a quiet toast to a moment that had challenged the room to be better. Brandon, meanwhile, stood in the back hallway, heart still pounding. The reality of what had just unfolded began to sink in. He had never been the best employee, but he had also never been called out in front of an entire room. Not like this, not by Keanu Reeves. He had expected anger, expected someone to yell at him or threaten his job. But instead, he had been met with something much worse. A quiet, undeniable truth. And that truth was simple. He had been wrong. Brandon sat in the manager's office, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint hum of conversation filtering in from the restaurant. Across from him, Calloway leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes steady. The weight of what had just happened hung between them, unspoken but unavoidable. Brandon could still feel the stares of the diners, the humiliation of having been publicly corrected, not just by anyone, but by Keanu Reeves. Calloway exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers against the desk. "I don't need to tell you how bad that looked," he said finally. "You humiliated a customer in front of an entire restaurant. And worse, you did it in front of someone the whole damn world respects. That's not just a mistake, Brandon. That's a stain on this place." Brandon's jaw tightened. He wanted to fight back, to argue that it wasn't his fault, that he had been overworked, underpaid, and just trying to do his job. But deep down, he knew Calloway was right. He had crossed a line, and there was no taking it back. The manager straightened, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm giving you two options," he said. "You can stay, but only if you agree to go through training. That includes disability awareness, customer service, and most importantly, learning how to treat people with respect. No shortcuts, no half-assing it." He paused, letting the words settle. "Or you can walk out that door and not come back." Brandon's stomach twisted. He had expected to be fired on the spot, but instead, he was being given a choice, a way to fix things. Yet something inside him resisted. The idea of being forced into a training program felt humiliating, like admitting he had been completely wrong, like surrendering. His pride screamed at him to refuse. His fingers drummed against his thigh as his thoughts warred with each other. Stay, swallow your pride and learn from this. Or leave and tell yourself you were never the problem. Brandon met Calloway's gaze, and before he could think better of it, he made his decision. "I'm done," he said. "I'm not going to sit through some useless training just because some Hollywood star decided to make an example out of me." The words tasted bitter the moment he said them, but he didn't take them back. His pride wouldn't let him. Calloway studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow, disappointed nod. "All right," he said, voice neutral. "Your final paycheck will be processed this week. Hand in your apron on the way out." Brandon stood stiffly, pushing back his chair with more force than necessary. He turned toward the door, gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had made his choice, but as he stepped out of the office, past the restaurant floor where Keanu Reeves was now seated again, calmly sipping his coffee, a thought crept into his mind. Was it the right one? Lucas exhaled slowly, still processing what had happened. His meal had arrived, placed in front of him by a different server, who had offered him a quiet, respectful nod before stepping away. He lifted his fork but hesitated. The food smelled good, and he knew he should feel relieved that the situation had been resolved, but something about it all still weighed on him. He wasn't naive. He had experienced dismissiveness before. He had seen the way people's patience wore thin the moment he needed something extra. But tonight had been different. Tonight, someone had stepped in. Someone had made it clear that he mattered. His gaze flickered toward Keanu, who was back at his table, flipping a page in his book. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and Keanu gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a simple acknowledgement. Nothing more. Lucas felt the tightness in his chest loosen, just a little. A slow, hesitant round of applause rippled through the restaurant. It wasn't loud, nor was it unanimous. Some guests clapped, others shifted awkwardly in their seats, unsure if they should. Lucas wasn't sure if it was meant for him, for Keanu, or for the moment itself. He didn't need to know. All that mattered was that people had seen. Brandon walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air hitting his face. He had expected to feel relieved, to feel like he had stuck to his principles, like he had walked away with his dignity intact. Instead, his stomach churned with something close to regret. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at the neon glow of the restaurant's sign, his fists clenched at his sides. He could still hear Calloway's voice in his head. You had options. For the first time since the confrontation, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth. He could have handled it differently. He could have slowed down, taken an extra minute to understand what Lucas needed. He could have chosen patience instead of frustration, but he hadn't. And now, he has lost his job because of it. A part of him wanted to storm back inside, to tell Calloway he had changed his mind, but he knew that wasn't how things worked. Some choices once made couldn't be undone. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. If he wanted to fix this, he would have to start somewhere else. Brandon turned away from the restaurant and started walking. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just running from a bad shift. He was running towards something better. The night had settled into an uneasy calm inside Le Vuchane. Conversations had resumed, but there was still an undercurrent of awareness in the air, a lingering weight from what had just unfolded. Some guests continued eating, some stole glances at Keanu, and others kept their heads down, pretending nothing had happened. But no one had truly forgotten. The energy of the place had shifted, and so had the way people looked at Lucas. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just a silent observer in a world that overlooked him. He was seen. Keanu remained at his table, his book open but untouched. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't seem to care. He wasn't waiting for applause or gratitude. He had done what he felt was right, and that was enough. Still, he was aware of the glances, the quiet murmurs that followed him. He could sense the silent reflection happening in the minds of those around him, people who had chosen not to speak up, people who had watched injustice unfold and done nothing. It was always easier to look away until someone made you see. Lucas focused on his meal, forcing himself to steady his hands as he lifted his fork. The food was good, but the taste barely registered. His mind replayed the last hour, the sharpness in Brandon's tone, the embarrassment that had coiled in his chest, the way Keanu had stood up for him without hesitation. People like Brandon weren't new to him, but people like Keanu were rare. He had never expected someone to step in, especially not someone like that. He wanted to believe it mattered. He wanted to believe things could change. In the back office, Calloway sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples. The restaurant had run smoothly for years, and now, in one evening, it had become a spectacle. Keanu Reeves calls out one of his waiters, a customer being humiliated, and the entire restaurant watching. This was the kind of moment that would spread, the kind of story that would find its way onto social media. He had no doubt people were already whispering about it outside. The damage wasn't just to one employee's reputation, it was to the restaurant itself, and that meant something had to change. The door creaked open, and a young server hesitated in the doorway. "Sir, we just got a call. Someone who was here earlier wants to leave a review about what happened." Calloway looked up sharply. He had expected complaints, but there was something in the way the server spoke, something hesitant. "What kind of review?" he asked, already dreading the answer. The server swallowed. They said it was a wake-up call, that they realized they had ignored things like this before, and they won't anymore. Calloway exhaled slowly. Maybe tonight hadn't just been a disaster. Maybe it had been a lesson. Brandon, meanwhile, was walking aimlessly through the streets. The city lights blurred in his vision, his thoughts a tangled mess of regret and resentment. His anger had faded, leaving behind something colder, something harder to ignore. He had told himself he was right to leave, that it wasn't his fault, that Keanu had blown things out of proportion, but deep down he knew the truth. It wasn't Keanu's presence that had cost him his job, it was his own arrogance. If he had just taken a second longer, if he had just chosen patience instead of frustration, things might have been different. He stopped in front of a diner, its neon sign flickering in the night. Through the window, he saw a waiter moving between tables, balancing plates with ease, smiling at customers, engaging with them. He used to be like that once, before the job became just another burden. Before he stopped seeing people and started seeing obstacles. He swallowed hard, realizing how much he had let bitterness shape him. He had a choice to make. He could let this be the end, or he could start over. But starting over meant facing what he had done. Back at Le Vauchain, Lucas was finishing his meal when Calloway stepped onto the restaurant floor. The manager's presence drew attention. He was not a man who usually addressed guests unless something was seriously wrong. He approached Lucas's table with measured steps, then glanced at Keanu before speaking. "Sir, I want to apologize for what happened tonight." Lucas looked up, his expression neutral, but his fingers lightly tapped against the table, a silent beat of tension. Calloway continued, his voice steady. "This restaurant should be a place where everyone feels welcome. We failed at that tonight, and I take responsibility for it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Starting next week, our staff will be undergoing training, not because we have to, but because we should have done it long ago. No one should have to struggle just to order a meal." He hesitated, then added, "I hope one day you'll come back and see the difference for yourself." Lucas studied him for a long moment. He had heard apologies before, empty ones, forced ones, the kind that were said just to move past discomfort. But this one felt real. He lifted his hands and signed, "I appreciate that." Calloway blinked, clearly not understanding the sign language, but Keanu, who had been watching quietly, translated for him. The manager gave a small, respectful nod. As the night wound down, Keanu stood, leaving a generous tip on the table before slipping on his jacket. He hadn't done this for attention. He hadn't done it to be a hero. He had done it because it was right, because no one should be made to feel invisible. As he moved toward the door, he caught Lucas's gaze one last time. A silent nod, a quiet understanding. Lucas sat for a moment after Keanu left, letting the evening settle around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the world had shifted, even just a little. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe there would still be people like Brandon. But there would also be people like Keanu. And that was enough. 1 week later, Lucas returned to Le Chêne. He hadn't planned to, but something inside him told him he needed to see if anything had changed. The restaurant looked the same from the outside, the same glowing sign, the same warm lighting spilling onto the sidewalk. But when he stepped in, he noticed something new. Near the entrance, a small plaque had been placed on the wall. It read, "Here, everyone is welcome." Beneath it was a simple symbol, one for accessibility and inclusion. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He was led to a table, this time by a different server, a woman who greeted him with a smile and, to his surprise, lifted her hands in an attempt at sign language. "Welcome," she signed. It was hesitant, a little unsure, but it was real. Lucas blinked, momentarily caught off guard, before nodding in acknowledgement. He could already tell something had changed. The way the servers moved, the way they interacted with customers. It was subtle, but there was a new awareness in the air. People were paying attention in ways they hadn't before. Meanwhile, miles away, Brandon sat in a small cafe, staring at a blank application form. His hands rested on the keyboard of his laptop, unmoving. He had been searching for jobs all week, but everywhere he looked, there was a sinking realization. He wasn't just looking for a new job. He was looking for a second chance. He had told himself he didn't regret his decision to leave, but as the days passed, regret was exactly what he felt. Not because he had lost his job, but because he had walked away from an opportunity to change. He had thought about going back, about swallowing his pride and asking Calloway if the offer still stood, but he knew some choices couldn't be undone. He had made his decision and now he had to live with it, but maybe, just maybe, he could still make something of himself. He wasn't ready to give up on himself yet. At Le Chêne, Lucas finished his meal in peace, this time with no tension, no struggle. As he stepped outside, he caught his reflection in the window, a person who had once felt invisible, now standing a little taller. He glanced back at the small sign near the entrance one last time before walking into the night. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. Across the city, Keanu Reeves sat in another cafe, unnoticed, flipping through the pages of a book. He didn't need to know what had come of that night. He didn't do things for recognition. But in the quiet corners of the world, change had already begun. This story is more than just an incident in a restaurant. It's a reflection of the choices we make every day, the choice to be patient or dismissive, the choice to speak up or stay silent, the choice to treat someone as an inconvenience or as a human being. Lucas's experience is not unique. There are people around us every day who face invisible barriers, who struggle in ways we may never fully understand. And in those moments, we are given an opportunity to ignore, to react with frustration, or to meet them with respect. Brandon's story is a reminder that pride can sometimes be our greatest downfall. It's easy to justify our actions in the moment, to push away accountability, to refuse to change. But growth only comes when we are willing to admit our mistakes and learn from them. Not everyone gets a second chance, but we can all choose to do better moving forward. And Keanu Reeves, he didn't need to raise his voice or make a grand spectacle. He simply stood up when no one else did. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is acknowledge someone who has been ignored for too long. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in this situation? And more importantly, the next time you witness something unfair, will you choose to stand up? If you love stories like this, stories that remind us of the kindness, courage, and humanity we should all strive for, subscribe to our channel, because tomorrow, we'll have another inspiring story you won't want to miss.